to our special board meeting Tuesday, August 25th. Welcome back, everybody. This is our first time back to the Ed Center since March, and it's nice to bring some vibrancy back to the Ed Center. I will then call the meeting to order. We also will be adding a report from the Committee of the Whole in camera for Trustee Lundquist to report on. Could I have a motion to approve the agenda? Trustee Noble, Trustee Morton, all in favor? Any declarations of interest are on the table this evening? Seeing none, we'll have a motion to, we'll go right to the report of the Committee of the Whole in camera for Trustee Lundquist.
Thank you, Chair Brainy. There are two matters to raise. The board approved the actions of the Committee of the Whole in camera and discussed personnel issues. There were no declarations of interest from the Committee of the Whole in camera. And the Associate Director Academic will bring forward any information regarding administrative transfer or promotion if applicable. There was also a motion passed that needs to come to the floor of a public board meeting. I'm going to read the motion. I just need to find the page on which it was located. The motion reads as follows. The board confirms that the Director of Education has the discretion to close a school or schools within the jurisdiction of the DDSB should staff absences be such that the situation presents an unreasonable risk to the health and safety of pupils and staff during the declared pandemic emergency. So we would need a motion to approve that and a vote in public to pass it.
Could we have a motion? Trustee Noble and Trustee Barnes seconded. All in favor? That carries. We then move on to information items. Our Durham Medical Officer of Health and a briefing that we'd like. Thank you for attending, Dr. Kyle. If you could also introduce your team members that are with you online, that would be appreciated.
Good evening, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, so thank you for inviting us. I think our understanding is we're here to answer any questions you have and to act as a resource. So with me is Dr. Pepe McTavish. She is our Assistant Medical Officer of Health. She has another speaking engagement at 7, so we'll be leaving prematurely. Lisa Fortuna is a Director of Health Protection, and Regina Elliott is a manager in our Population Health Division and is our lead manager with respect to our school health program. So as I understand it, I'm to make a few opening remarks, and then I'll turn it back to you, Chair, to answer any questions that the trustees may have. So let me start by saying that with respect to where we're at in Durham Region regarding the epidemiology of COVID-19, I think it's fair to say that we're at the end of the first wave. If you haven't had a chance to look at our data tracker, which is the main means that we use to communicate information about COVID-19 in real time, we're at 1,868 cases. For the past many weeks, actually, on average, the number of cases that are reported to us vary from 0 at the low to about 5. It sometimes goes a little bit higher per day. Currently, we have no institutional outbreaks. For the past little while, the transmission in Durham Region have been community transmission, so no link to any other cases, or contacts. These are links to cases of COVID-19. So we're awaiting the second wave, and COVID-19 is smoldering there. With respect to the guidelines with respect to reopening schools, I think it's important to say that those decisions have been taken centrally by the Ministry of Education, informed by the Ministry of Health. We are not privy to the information provided to the Ministry of Education from the Ministry of Health, so we're really in no position to second-guess those policy decisions, nor are we aware of any legal authority to provide additional policy at the local level. Having said that, we agree with the general approach of the Guide to Reopening Schools, which take a layered or a kind of a multiple approach to preventing COVID-19. And I won't drill down, but you know what a lot of those measures are: screening, hand hygiene, respiratory etiquette, physical distancing, cohorting, those sorts of things, those sort of multiple approaches that are embedded into the guidelines, and they're very consistent with the COVID-19 workplace safety plan guidelines, which in our world speaks to a hierarchy of control, from elimination all the way down to the use of PPE. The last thing I'll say in terms of introductory remarks is that from a public health perspective, we're working in a public health system which at the federal level is led by the Public Health Agency of Canada, led by the Chief Public Health Officer, and at the provincial level, the Chief Medical Officer of Health, informed by the Ministry of Public Health Ontario. So I think, like you, we are implementers, and our focus is on case and control and outbreak management. It's data management and public reporting. It's public health messaging, and by and large, that's done on our social media platforms and based on messaging by myself. For a while, we were involved in long-term care homes, retirement homes, congregate living centers, surveillance, and we also facilitate testing and test results. With respect to our role up to now, with respect to school boards and schools, if you don't mind me just reading a few lines, our activities to date have included providing guidance and responding to questions throughout the COVID response, and our lead school health contacts have been available to the DDSB through email and phone. We've provided guidance related to public health measures in order to support schools in operating their plans, and we've been involved in a couple of teleconference meetings, and we've developed a checklist to assist in the development of plans for schools reopening. In terms of new initiatives, we have received a draft school outbreak management document, and we're digesting it, and details will follow. And finally, planning is underway with respect to support at the school level with the school public health nurses, and Regina can speak to that more fully depending on your questions and answers. So I think I'll stop there. I've tried to tell you what the local epidemiology is. I've tried to let you know who have been the decision makers up to now with respect to policy in this area. I've tried to talk generally about our role, and then specifically our role with respect to schools. I think the last thing I'll say, and I'll conclude with this, is that not only has COVID-19 been a marathon, is a marathon rather than a sprint, but we're learning as we go along, and of course, after the schools reopen, we'll continue to learn, we'll continue to adapt as necessary. So I think I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Chair, to entertain any questions trustees may have. We may not have the answers, in which case we will do our best to report back to you. And there may be questions where we cannot answer because we do not have the information and/or we're not the appropriate credible sources to provide you with that information. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle. And again, we realize you and your team, your time's precious, and we appreciate you being here this evening. But I'll go around the table, ask if there's any questions of yourself and your team.
Chair, can you put me on there? It's Paul.
Go ahead, Trustee Crawford.
Oh, okay. Looking at the stats, I noted that there's about 6% that are under 20 in the age categories. This probably is an obvious question or comment, but I'd like to hear what you have to say about it, is that the 6% under 20, of course, would be students, and students have not been active in school all during this period of time. How do we get a proper read on that when we know that the students were mostly at home and, of course, would be coming in contact with COVID?
So I think so thank you for the question. I think that's a fair question. I think that question speaks to my concluding remark, is that we have to learn as we go along. Having said that, in some of the documents that I've looked at, they have drawn inferences from experiences in other jurisdictions. But you're quite right. The bulk of the cases in Durham have been in adults and seniors, and in part that's probably a reflection of there's been no school activity, if you will, since the March break.
Thank you. Trustee Lundquist?
I'm going to ask for a little bit of patience because I admit that I have 1,000 questions, and I'm going to try to minimize that to less than 1,000 questions. So I'm concerned by a bunch of things, and I recognize what you're saying in terms of the decisions are being made by the Chief Medical Officer of Health for Ontario, but we are being asked to implement a plan that's actually, in my view, really under-resourced, and we're continuing to improvise 2 weeks with less than 2 weeks to go to school, and that's worrisome to me as a trustee who is tasked with making decisions about safety for kids in the system. So I have a bunch of concerns about the recommendations, and I appreciate that you may be unwilling to comment on some of those concerns in light of your initial remarks, but I think that they are really important because they are the concerns that parents are expressing. We're asking parents to make decisions for their children, and we are not able to provide them with the information that they feel is adequate to safely determine whether their children should be in a school or not. So I have to preface all of that by saying I apologize if I'm being difficult, because I don't intend to be at all. It's just that I've written to you once, as you may or may not recollect, on behalf of myself, but also on behalf of parents who've expressed these concerns. So in a nutshell, here is my fundamental concern. A lot of the recommendations are guidelines, and those guidelines came from a joint report by Sick Kids and others, including Holland Bloorview, et cetera. In that draft guideline, which was meant to be a starting point, not a finishing point, it appears that this 1 meter distancing recommendation is, they're saying it's not as good as 2, but it's probably adequate. That's how a lay person reads that, I think. What I'm concerned about is if we cannot keep a 1 meter distance as part of the hierarchy of controls for health and safety, what measures should we be implementing, if we are not already implementing them, to actually keep people safe?
So So thank you for the question. First of all, I can't comment on whether the Sick Kids report was one of the foundational documents considered by the Ministry of Education when it finalized its guidelines for schools reopening. I'm not in the loop, and I can't comment on that. My read of the guidelines and my read of the Sick Kids report indicates that I think a lot of the measures beyond physical distancing that you would employ to minimize the risk are certainly embedded in the guidelines, and I assume in the school's plan. So it talks about hand hygiene, environmental cleaning, beyond physical distancing, cohorting, those sorts of measures. So there's quite a long list of measures embedded in the guidelines that I think are faithful to the Sick Kids report. But again, I don't know whether or not the Sick Kids report informed the decision making. And of course, non-medical masks is part of that terrain, and limiting certain activities, music comes to mind, and all that, all those sorts of things. So I think if you take that as a whole, a lot of measures currently are in place to mitigate the risk, coupled with the fact that at this point in time, we do have a low transmission in Durham region, and the epidemiology is such that we're in a, I'm going to say, a quiet state, although of course things can change as a result of the school reopening. So I think that's what I would say. There are a lot of measures that are in place beyond just physical distancing, and I think they're faithful to the Sick Kids report, but I can't comment whether or not Sick Kids report was a key driver to the guidelines for school reopening.
Thank you. So I am confident that the Sick Kids report was key to that decision making, because both the Premier and the Minister have repeatedly said so. So I don't need you to answer that part for me. I'm entirely clear on that. What I'm not clear about still, though, is if we can't maintain a minimum standard of 1 meter between children, and it says 2 meters between pupil and teacher, and those children are younger than grade 4, so they're unmasked, does that pose a level of risk that we should be concerned about?
Well, I can't speak to whether or not you should be concerned about it, but there certainly is risk.
And the risk is for increased risk of transmission, I presume.
That's right. So if you look at COVID-19, first of all, it's spread through droplet spread. So what that means is the means of transmission is somebody who is infected transmit the virus, and it's picked up by someone else, usually on their hands, but depending on whether they're symptomatic, coughing, that sort of thing, it could be into the mucous membranes, but it is by droplet spread. So there is a risk, and all one can do is try to mitigate that risk, but it is spread through droplet transmission. The evidence to date suggests that the ability for kids to transmit is lower than adults. and the risk of transmission is lower than adults. We don't know a lot about asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic transmission in kids. That certainly is a possibility. And of course, for kids who have symptoms, the main way of mitigating that risk is by encouraging them, if not stopping them from coming to school, and having them stay at home while they're symptomatic. So that's kind of what we know so far with respect to the epidemiology. But again, we're learning as we go along. The evidence is not absolutely clear. And I think the evidence to date is drawn from other jurisdictions. So how well it can be generalized to Ontario and indeed Canada, I can't comment on.
I appreciate that. And this is my final point, because I know other trustees would really like your attention as well. But I've actually been doing some work on this particular issue with respect to health and safety in other workplaces. And we are also an employer. We have students that we need to protect, but we're also an employer that has health and safety obligations to the staff in the schools. And in my recent readings, I was reading Justice Campbell SAR's report, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. So it was a really significant bunch of recommendations that came out after SARS. And in it, he actually referenced something that I think is really important, and I just want to be clear that I'm not missing something in this, and I feel like you might be better positioned than I am to understand it. But he said, when there's reasonable evidence of an impending threat to public harm, it's inappropriate to require proof of causation beyond a reasonable doubt before taking steps to avert the threat. That reasonable effort to reduce risk need not await scientific proof. It's the precautionary principle. We have an elevated duty of care, essentially, as an employer. And so in light of that, I'm not asking you, I understand your reticence to speak about the Chief Medical Officer of Health's observations, but it's been pretty clear to me that that didn't protect hospitals after SARS from making decisions with respect to workers, and it potentially isn't enough for us. And so are you able or willing to comment on the use of the precautionary principle as it relates to us protecting staff? Do we need to adopt further measures, or are we comfortable that those measures that have been adopted in government policy is adequate?
So if you're talking about what steps you need to take to protect teachers, is that kind of where you're coming at?
It's teachers, it's educational staff. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Dr. Kyle. I really just wanted to say we have teachers, we have educational assistants who work very closely beside students. We have bus drivers who are going to be on a bus with upwards of 60 kids or 70 kids in a contained space. And I would just like to know if, in those circumstances, whether distance, how important the distance measures are, how important masking is, because I'm worried that we haven't done enough yet. And I don't know if you can comment on those kinds of measures as they would apply to staff working closely with children, both physically in small spaces and generally in terms of the suite of protections that we need to provide to reduce the public health risk to them.
Well, I don't have the guidelines in front of me. Clearly, there is a risk to staff, so teachers and other staff in the school setting. I think there is a duty for there to be appropriate occupational health and safety measures. Without looking at the specific measures that you're talking about, I really can't comment on them. I don't have them in front of me. if what you're getting at is the suite of PPE, for example, that teachers and staff should be wearing, I need to look at that and comment on that, and perhaps that's something you can send to us offline. But I would be shocked if the guidelines didn't take appropriate occupational health and safety considerations and risk into account. In terms of the precautionary principle, again, I'd have to look at Justice Campbell's report. My recollection was that had to do, at least in part, as to the level of protection inherent in PPE, and should it be, for example, surgical masks versus PPE. Whether or not you can translate that experience into the school setting, I'd really need to look at specifics before commenting authoritatively with respect to the measures that are in place. But I don't have any specific philosophical objections to precautionary principle.
Okay. I will leave my other 998 questions for other people. Thank you.
Any other trustees around the table right now? Person have any questions? Any online? No, Trustee Crawford, we've heard from you. Trustee Templeton, go ahead.
It's just a straightforward question to Dr. Kyle. Can you think of any safety reasons why JK grade 3 should not wear a medical mask or a non-medical mask?
Yeah, so I guess I have a couple of thoughts based on what I've looked at and why there are pros and cons to any potential measure. In terms of the cons, if you had a child who was a transmitter, asymptomatic, assuming that they are in class in good faith and not ill and should be at home, what you have to bear in mind then is, first of all, the mask is in place to protect others. And so if they're a transmitter, they are contaminating the mask. So if the mask is uncomfortable, if it is poorly worn, if it causes a child to continually touch the mask, touch their face, then not only are they contaminating their hands and potentially infecting others, but if others are wearing masks and the same thing is happening, and to the extent that through touching other individuals and so forth, and then going back and touching their face and their mask and so forth, they may be inadvertently contaminating themselves if there are other transmitters in the classroom. If you read about the use of masks, it talks about the use of hand hygiene. And that's very important because we're talking about a potentially contaminated surface. We don't know who the transmitters are, and it needs to be understood that you don and doff masks, and when you doff them, you really should be discarding them, and you should be exercising hand hygiene. So you're best placed, rather than me, as to how feasible and practical it is to expect that type of behavior in younger kids. And I suspect that that is part of the reasoning that went into excluding mandatory masking under, I think it's grade 4. it may do more harm than good, bearing in mind that we don't know in a classroom how many transmitters there may be. The risk may be very low, in which case the con, if you will, that we've just been talking about may be fairly low, but may pick up if transmission occurs and that sort of thing. So I think it's the potential harm that wearing masks, coupled with perhaps the difficulty in managing the masks, and if you look at a classroom as a whole, the potential of, by repeated touching your face, adjusting your mask, and so forth, you may be inadvertently transmitting the virus to yourself. So I think those are the considerations that may have gone into it. And if in fact Sick Kids report was a foundational document going into the current guidelines, I think it speaks to some of those challenges.
Thank you. We'll go to Trustee Thatcher. Forbes, do you have you have a question too?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so we'll go to Trustee
Thank you, and
Thatcher.
through you, Chair Brainy.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Kyle, I do, as I believe all of us appreciate your position. I think we can relate, as I believe we're in a similar situation. We do have, I want to speak to some of the same things that my fellow trustees are speaking to. We do have limited knowledge about our youngest students, those from K to 3, but I also do understand, and I'm going to read this, the ministry will support any board decision to mandate mask K to 3 if this is recommended by the local health unit. So would this be a recommendation that you would make?
So at this point in time, I wouldn't make that recommendation. I think that I'm in no position to second guess the policy decision by the Ministry of Education. I think there is a con side to requiring masking at younger ages. And I think you have to look at, if you were to do that at younger ages, and I think you have to think through the exemption piece. So if you were to go down that road, who would you exempt based on medical, psychological, other conditions? And then what does it mean if you're not going to enforce that? And if you don't enforce it, then where you land is with a strong recommendation, which perhaps is stronger language than encourage. And I think, strongly recommend has been a consistent message from all public health authorities. But I do think that I do think there is a con side to this. I think, given the local epidemiology, given the con side of this argument, and given that I think the Ministry of Education and Ministry of Health have given due consideration of this, at this point in time, I wouldn't be recommending mandatory mask use. But things can change, and I think we have to see how things go. And if the epidemiology changes, if there are other reasons for reconsidering, then I think it would be prudent to look at it at that point in time. But I wouldn't be recommending it at this point in time.
Supplemental?
Go ahead.
What measures then would you recommend that we put in place to safeguard the staff working with these students?
Yeah, so in preparation for tonight's meeting, I was looking more at guidelines. I was looking more at information I had with respect to the evidence and so forth and so on. So I'm really not in a position to comment tonight, but if you do have OC health and safety plans that you could send to us, we would be happy to look at those and provide you with the recommendations if we haven't already done so. But I'm really not in a position to give you specifics tonight, but happy to look at that.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle. I'm happy to follow up with that.
To be cognizant of your time and your team, Dr. Kyle, I've got Trustee Forbes, Trustee Noble, Trustee Lundquist, and I have a question, and we'll end it off at there if that's okay. If we have 4 more questions, that'd be great. Go ahead, Trustee.
And myself, Mr. Chair.
Trustee Crawford, I know that Dr. Kyle and his team have very limited time, and you did have a question, so I'm just going to take the 4 and let them do things that they need to do tonight. Okay? Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Forbes.
Thank you, Chair Brainy. So, I mean, we're quite fortunate in this large room to have social distancing of 2 meters or more between trustees and staff. We know that won't always be the case for our students and our educational staff in schools, as well as bus drivers on buses. So I guess I'm wondering, are there best practices that you're aware of, or maybe this is something that you can forward to us surrounding mask use in students who might have special needs, where they may not be readily able to understand the necessity of having a mask, regardless of their chronological age?
So the short answer is I don't know, but we will take that question back and follow up with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Noble, then we'll go to Lundquist, and I have a question. We'll finish off there. Thank you. Go ahead, Trustee Noble.
Thank you, Chair Brainy. I just had a question regarding an earlier comment made regarding masks from K to 3. I'm not sure where the difference comes in between them not wearing masks and them wearing masks, based on the comments that you made regarding how masks, if they're touched, if they touch other desks afterwards, that contamination could happen there through transmitters. But if they're not wearing masks, could they also still not cough into their hands and then touch desks, therefore still transmitting COVID-19? And I believe there was another school board, I'm not sure of all of them, that did make this mandatory. And I'm really concerned with the phrase, see how things go, because this is a pandemic that we haven't had one like this since the Spanish flu in 1918. And I don't think we have room for trial and error here, especially when it comes to the lives and well-beings of our students and staff.
So if you have a transmitter and they cough on their hands, and their hand then touches another child's hand, and that person in turn has their hand touch their face or whatever, is that a means of transmission? Yes, it is. I think there was another, I don't know if it was a comment or a question beyond that, but that's what I heard. Could sneezing into one's hands act as a means of transmission? Yes, it can. I think your comment was we shouldn't be entertaining trial and error. All I can say is, in terms of masking, there is a downside to masking, particularly in younger kids, and I take it that was taken into account when the Ministry of Education made their policy decision. And I totally get that if you disagree with that and you think the risk is too great, that given the circumstances in the classroom, better to err on the side of caution than not. I'm in no position really to disagree with you. I think you're going to have to land on acceptable risk.
Thank you. Trustee Lundquist?
So you've repeatedly said, you're not in a position to second guess the ministry, but we have to. And the reason we have to is because these decisions aren't just public health decisions from the ministry, they're political decisions. They're about expediency and cost, and it's about a bunch of other things. So we're actually trying our very best to make sure that students and staff are safe, and we are struggling with the idea that we are told in certain settings that these elements of layered health and safety are necessary. So in a grocery store, you have to wear a mask. In a grocery store, you have to socially distance. You, of course, hand hygiene and whatnot. But we don't have those applying to our schools. And that, to somebody like me, that seems really extraordinary that we are giving lesser protection in schools than in stores. And you commented earlier on in the course of the pandemic about the needs to physically distance in commercial establishments, and you commented on the need to mask in commercial establishments. And I'm really struggling to understand why this is different. And I'm hoping you can help us, because this is the fundamental question I think that I get asked the most from parents. It is what the public wants to know. Why is it different for schools than in every other social activity? And I don't know the answer. I don't know how to respond to it because it seems incongruent to me. So that's the one part of my question. And the second part of the question is, are we getting protocols in place that we will see before the start of school about what will happen in terms of outbreak management? Because parents aren't clear on that part either. Thank you.
So with respect to your first question, you may be referencing instructions we've issued to businesses, for example, with respect to masking in indoor public places. And I don't want to appear to be either officious or non-caring. I guess we wrote the instructions in such a way that first, we had a legal basis to do so. And we specifically excluded those types of businesses or services or institutions where we understood rules were being established and protocols being established for those specific sectors. And we specifically excluded schools because I think there are two aims of the Ministry of Education, and of course I can't speak to them. Not only is there the, I guess the public health, occupational health and safety aspects of COVID-19, but there's also the access to education, and I think the Ministry of Education is best placed to sort of balance the need for students to return to school, to access education, while at the same time ensuring to the extent possible the setting is as safe as possible, using hierarchy of controls, layered approaches, that sort of thing. And I think they've tried to do that. So I don't know if it's different or not, but that is why schools were specifically excluded from our instructions, as are a list of other institutions, businesses, or services. With respect to your second question, we have seen the draft of the school-based outbreak management guidelines. I think it's version 8 that we've seen. We're digesting it. We're trying to internalize it, but it's not finalized. I understand that it's awaiting Deputy Minister approval, so it should be issued shortly. And once it is, Regina and her team will be reaching out to all the school boards to issue protocols, documents, procedures, so that it's clear what steps need to be taken, who does what, that sort of thing, in accordance with the guidelines. So it should be completed shortly. We're waiting on approval, but we're working behind the scenes with respect to communications regarding this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Kyle. So the last question I have for you is from myself. Do you have any concerns or recommendations regarding distancing with students on buses?
So I'm going to turn, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn that question over to Lisa, who really has been our lead with respect to transit services. And if I need to weigh in, I will. But Lisa, can you take on that question?
Sure, I'm happy to. So we did review the plan that was submitted to us, and we have also reviewed the provincial reopening plan as it relates to transportation. From the plan that Durham District School Board and the Catholic School Board has in place, it looks like there is a good alignment. The main key messages: stay home if you're sick, washing your hands, students being assigned to seats. And all students have to wear the non-medical mask, because I think it is recognized that it is a challenge to, more of a challenge to physical distance on the buses. So I think from our perspective, as I said, it's well aligned with the recommendations. And I think if those controls are in place, then I think everything, as Dr. Kyle said, we'll have to see how it goes, which I know is not the answer you like. But as I said, if those controls are in place, then I think there is some good precautions there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kyle, and thank you to you too, Lisa, for your feedback on that. And we do appreciate you taking the time. We understand how busy you are, and I think we have had some clarification and certainly some more insight into some of our concerns. So we appreciate your time this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I ask a question, Mr. Chair? Just a quick question.
Trustee Crawford, I'm cognizant of their time. I think it's, as I said, I did rule that we would only take one more question, so I would like to give them the opportunity to go and do the many things that they have to do. So I'm going to say no.
Would it be possible, excuse the interruption, would it be possible for us to put further questions in a written document to be forwarded for a response?
I think that would be a good suggestion. And would you be open to that, Dr. Kyle, if there are any further questions that people may think of, not only this evening, but in the next few days, if we did put something forward, just to have a response to that would be appreciated, if that's okay?
Yeah, absolutely. No concerns.
Thank you. Okay. So then move on to item B. I'm going to turn it over to Acting Director Marsh.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Brainy. I want to begin this evening's report actually with a warm welcome to our 3 new superintendents that we're so pleased to have with us in the boardroom this evening. So welcome to Superintendent Jack Negro, Superintendent Aaron Elmhurst, and Superintendent Gary Crossdale. They could not have joined the team at a better time in terms of the way that they're assisting us with the work. I'm going to ask for the presentation, the slideshow, to please be put up on the screen so that the trustees are able to see it. we thought that in terms of an introduction to the 2 staff reports that are coming forward this evening, it would be valuable to walk through the context of where we are in terms of a timeline and the work that staff have been doing in readiness for the return to school. And so the timeline, once it goes up, will reflect that the first part of the timeline reflects really the work that occurred between June 19th and the June 19th memo that the Ministry of Education released, and it becomes relevant, I think, in terms of where we are today based on the actions we took in June. So during that time, we did, in reflection of the ministry survey, ministry memo did survey families in terms of their return to school preference and other items related potentially to pandemic management and distance learning. During that time, we were charged with creating models for potential different scenarios, and we worked diligently as staff as well as with other district school boards to do model creation in light of not being sure of what return to school would look like in September. You'll see on that timeline that July 30th was a major time marker for us, because at that time the ministry revised the direction that they gave us and released a second memo. And that memo was a pivotal moment for us as a senior team, because we understood the content of that memo immediately meant we had to shift in terms of the thinking we had been doing prior to that, and that we would have to restaff and re-timetable the system for the creation of a virtual school. And we did communicate with families immediately the same day that that memo was released, because we understood the significance of re-timetabling and restaffing would actually mean then that parents would have to make and families would have to make a choice, because we couldn't staff both the virtual school and physical schools. And so on July 30th, we informed families that that decision would be pending. And on July 31st, in obligation of trying to provide families with as much information as possible, we did release a return to school website, and we also released the registration for the virtual school. The registration for the virtual school was open from July 31st to August 12th. And during that time, we also knew we had to change our physical school models. We worked from July 30th memo until August 5th, which was the date the Ministry of Education identified that they would meet with district staff. In that meeting with the Ministry of Education, there were 3 main topics that we discussed. One was the concern we had as staff. If there was a focus on mental health and well-being, we made the recommendation to the Ministry of Education that they remove the requirement from the Growing Success policy document in terms of having exams at secondary school, and that they waive the 70% term work, 30% final summative assessment task, and that we convert exam days into instructional days. That was a request we made on August 5th. We have made that request subsequently twice. We have yet to be informed whether or not we can build a school year calendar that removes the exam days and focuses on instructional days for students. It is our opinion that having students in the quadmester model writing exams or final summative assessment tasks in the short period of time of a quadmester is not in the best interest of their mental health and well-being, and we feel very strongly about that and will continue to advocate. We have also worked with other district school boards in relation to exam days, and it is definitely a predominant theme that other boards would be supportive of it, and so we will now advocate as a collective to the Ministry of Education to make that change. We also had the opportunity to speak about Brock High School and other high schools where we had been contacted from families in terms of did they have to be in the adaptive model. And we asked the Ministry of Education, specifically based on the requests that we received from a few families in terms of the cases of COVID-19 within their communities and whether or not they could go conventional while most of the district school board was in an adaptive model. During that time, we heard that the ministry would be open to such a conversation, but they asked us to be patient and to actually start the year in an adaptive model. Since then, they have changed, and they have opened up a process for the potential for school boards to consider requesting certain schools be converted into the conventional model. It is staff's opinion at this time, given the uncertainty of the conditions of the return to school and the practices that we have predominantly through the adaptive model, we believe it is important to start the school year with all secondary schools in the adaptive model. The third item we discussed with the Ministry of Education, which was the dominant item, was the model for adaptive schooling and the virtual school. That conversation went very well with the Ministry of Education, and in fact they subsequently asked to share our modeling province-wide, believing that we had created a creative model that met the requirements. Based on that feedback, on August 6th, we were able to release our models to families, and from an operational perspective felt that by doing so, families could make a relatively informed choice in terms of the models that we were working with and what the school day would look like, so that they could make the registration due date by August 12th for the virtual school. We then, as of August 12th, we closed the registration for families to choose the virtual school, and if they did not register for the virtual school, we did make the assumption that they would be returning to their home school. We did not like to ask families to re-register should they not be making any change, and that was the reason for that decision. One of the things we are noting, however, we said to families that we weren't sure whether or not we could accommodate requests for change after August 12th. However, we've asked them to continue to contact us should they wish to make a change. In terms of the virtual school, and we feel much more comfortable at this point accepting registrations that are going from the physical school to the virtual school, because we're not so far along in the staffing process that that's not possible for us to accommodate well. In one of the reports, the one that Acting Associate Director Markovsky will bring forward, you'll see that we are looking now to waitlist any new requests to shift from virtual to physical schools, depending on the class size, because we have accomplished the 1 meter between students, which Acting Associate Director Markovsky will outline in greater detail. I wanted to mention this, though, because I think it's relevant. Between Friday and Monday, we received 800 more requests from in-person physical schooling to the virtual school, and so the numbers are still fluctuating significantly. And so that, while we are prepared and have been doing staffing and re-timetabling, we are also recognizing that there is still a high demand to go into the virtual school, and that has then informed some of our staffing decisions, which we'll discuss a little bit later. From August 13th to 25th, we are looking at then doing the restaffing. Last week, our administrators all returned a week early, did an amazing job spacing things out, along with facility services, who has been working all summer long to clear classrooms of potential items that would cause safety risks from the perspective of not being able to clean them well. So our classrooms are going to look significantly different for our students. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that in the second report that comes forward from staff this evening. Wanted to flag, though, that they have done an amazing job in ensuring that when our educators return next week to the schools, that they don't necessarily need to focus on bundling up the books and bookcases and moving bookcases. All of that work is being done. So next week, when our educators return, we have 3 PA days scheduled with them, and the main priority of those 3 PA days is to focus on health and safety from a staff perspective, walking them through the pandemic planning and the COVID-19 planning that we have done thus far. I think that it's very appropriate the question was asked in terms of when we can expect to get the provincial COVID-19 management plan from the province. We have been asking for weeks now to have that document so that we can inform our planning, and definitely to inform our PA days next week, because we know that families and staff have many questions, that the answers lie within that document, and it's not appropriate for us to speculate as to what could be in that document rather than wait for the document. So we will continue to advocate advocate from the staff perspective to staff at the Ministry of Education to have that document released. However, we have done an incredible amount of work over the summer from a health and safety perspective and safety protocols, and so those documents will be ready to go. And so on those 3 days with staff, on the PA days, we'll give them an opportunity to digest the content of those documents and then have some actual time to work through it in their physical classrooms or doors where they're going to be managing students, so that they can start to consider from their own experience, and their voice is very important in this process. If there's something within the protocol that they're not sure how it's going to work, given what they know from an educator perspective, that they have that opportunity when they're in that physical space to flag that, and we have an opportunity then to work with them in addressing the concerns that they may have. On August 14th, we did decide to go with the staggered approach in terms of the Ministry of Education's permission to go 2 weeks. The board had previously approved that for kindergarten, and I think it was very enthusiastically embraced in terms of the opportunity to teach students in smaller groups the health and safety protocols that we know are extremely important in a successful return to school. We've also flagged that their well-being and mental health after returning from the pandemic, and we recognize families have had a variety of experiences, that it's important for that quality time in terms of building the relationship. And so we did on August 14th launch that information in terms of a staggered start, and this week we did release more details in terms of that. Recognize some families will have some hardships in terms of childcare, and so we're committed to working with those families where they may be in that situation. I think that the only other thing that I will mention as far as the timeline and the PA days is that we're, in addition to focusing on the safety protocols, we've made a commitment as a district to focus on anti-Black racism and anti-oppression. And so we will spend some time on those PA days as far as identifying some key themes for staff, understanding that we will have compulsory learning throughout the year on that topic. The Ministry of Education also identified that for those 3 days we needed to look at the new math curriculum at the elementary level. We're very disappointed at this point that we don't have more information that was promised to us in terms of responses to questions we have about that math curriculum and training sessions. The Ministry of Education offered a training session in June and committed to more resource packages and further training in August. We attended an August session. Staff took the time to attend the ministry session, which appeared to be identical to the June session. For that reason, at this point, we are not going to be focusing on the elementary new math. We believe the well-being of our students will be a focus on those 3 days, the health and safety protocols, and the anti-Black racism, and wanted to make sure that our community knew that as soon as we have the resources that have been promised to us, we will work with our elementary staff in terms of the implementation of that curriculum, because it's our obligation to do so. However, we recognize that in the priorities of this fall, that we want them to focus on those other items that we're privileging in those 3 days. So I think that puts the 2 reports coming forward tonight in a bit of a context as far as the work we've been doing since June. And I'm going to turn it over first to Superintendent Davis, who has been leading the way as far as the virtual school, and she will update you on the progress we've made there, and then we'll get to the next agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you, and Chair, through you, the report can be found on pages 1 to 17 of the agenda package. The purpose of this report is to give the trustees an update on the DDSB at Home startup planning. On this first slide, we are just sharing with you that on August 13th, the Ministry of Education provided all school boards with a policy and procedure, PPM 164, which outlines the requirements for remote learning for public schools in Ontario. PPM 164 stipulates the requirements for real-time and flex-time learning. I will review the definitions of these terms, as many families may be online with us this evening. Real-time, also referred to as synchronous learning, is learning that happens in real time. It involves using text, video, or voice communication in a way that enables educators to instruct and connects with students in real time. It provides educators and students with an interactive way to learn. Flex time, also referred to as asynchronous learning, is learning that is not delivered in real time. Flex time learning may involve students watching pre-recorded video lessons, completing assigned tasks, or contributing to online discussion boards. As of August 21st, we had around 13,000 students who were enrolled in DDSB at home. This number continues to fluctuate, and I believe it is up to over 14,000 at this point, with around 11,300 elementary and around 3,000 secondary. Students with special education needs, the students with individual education plans, account for approximately 1,700 of our DDSB at home student enrollment. Therefore, we will be planning to support all students' social, emotional, and academic needs while addressing their strengths and areas of growth. At DDSB at home, we will be learning about relationships, resiliency, inclusion, and well-being through all aspects of the curriculum. We will be learning how to learn, and the learning will be in the work. Imagine a learning environment where success for students looks like clear expectations for all, differentiated relevant tasks with ownership for learning and feedback, engaging, challenging teaching and learning in support of student achievement, ongoing homeschool communication, and differences in abilities are respected. This is the vision for DDSB at home. We are creating a learning community where building relationships and developing healthy social connections is the foundation of our teaching and learning goals. As you can see in slide 2, we've posted sample schedules of the website that indicate what a learning day will look like at DDSB. The schedule will involve real-time learning as well as flex-time learning, along with natural breaks. The secondary schedule will mirror the in-person schedule, including start and end times. The elementary schedule on your left, the times in the schedules will be adjusted in response to the age and stage of the students. On slide 3, we talk about communication, and the learning that is in the work is part of our next steps. In terms of communication, DDSB at home has a web presence that has been created, where we've provided frequently asked questions and updated information. We will be contacting our families through phone calls and emails by grade and panel, and providing school newsletters and regular communication. We are committed to home and school continuing that communication loop. And we are planning the DDSB at home virtual open houses to share the next steps and details with parents and guardians. Parents and guardians will receive information about this shortly, and it will take place next week. Learning while we work means that we will use the feedback about and from the following to inform our planning and next steps: the level of student engagement, the ease of online learning, access to teachers and educators, ease of access to technology, and thought exchanges and surveys to receive the feedback. We would like to thank all parents and staff who continue to give us feedback, because we will continually be seeking feedback to inform our learning and our work. And at DDSB at home, we're committed to equity, well-being, engagement, innovation, and success. We will achieve this through continuous communication and through building a virtual community with high expectations for teaching and learning. Thank you for your patience while we continue to plan for student success at DDSB at home. That concludes my report.
Thank you. At this time, I think it's very cognizant to thank. I think we're very privileged to have Acting Director Marsh and this team that I know the exhausting hours that you've all put into planning the best start possible for our school board, and I think that it's been exemplary with the stakeholders, parents, the conversations you've had with community members. But we've all worked very well as a team. Also, the trustees around this table, I think we've seen an unprecedented year, and your time and involvement, I think we've all come together really well as a team to try to put together the best start and develop confidence in the community. So I commend you all for that. At this time, I'm not sure if there's any questions. Trustee Morton, go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Brainy. This is a comment for Director Marsh. I just want to thank you for your focus of those 3 PA days. I completely agree with your position on concentrating on the safety and well-being of our staff and students, and I know that that math curriculum can wait. Our well-being is the most important thing, and I commend you for prioritizing that. Thank you.
Trustee Barnes?
Thank you. I just wanted to check and ask 2 questions. Once schools have started, do we have a process that's going to be clear and in place for parents as to how they can transition between the different virtual school and on-site school, so it will be a clear process that they'll understand?
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that we have is our DDSB at Home website. It's on the DDSB.ca website, but there will be a website specifically for the school, which we will update with frequently asked questions, which right now, one of those questions is that question in terms of how to transition. And as Associate Director Marsh had said, there is a point where the students can transition into virtual, but at a certain point, we do need to respect the instructional times and those assessments, and we've put that on the FAQ, but we will always have that information on the website for parents, and they can also contact the school and the school principal for details as well.
Thank you. I think that will be very important to be very clear for parents so they can know how that works or when they can do it. The other part is, and this we might get into this at the later point, when we're talking about assessment, are we going to have, so we've petitioned the government not to change those exam days, but are we going to have a process or a specific procedure for assessment so everybody's sort of on the same page in regards to how students are being assessed, elementary and secondary?
Thank you. So through you, Chair, both the elementary and secondary curriculum departments are going to be supporting the educators in terms of assessments. Recognize actually it's about the teaching as well as the assessing and evaluating. And so the pedagogy for teaching virtually is very different than the pedagogy for in-person teaching. And so both departments are working currently to be releasing supportive documents for educators to work through. One of the advantages we have in terms of the setup we've done for the virtual schools, we'll have a lot of students and therefore teachers who are teaching the same grade as part of the same school. And so we're actually hoping that while the circumstances that brought us to this virtual school are not what any of us would wish for, there is actually an opportunity within this context to really build a community of teachers teaching the same curriculum, sharing resources, considering their assessment plans collaboratively, and that's how we'll move forward. The assessments will be different potentially online or virtually versus what you might experience in person, but that would vary as it does currently classroom by classroom in terms of the teachers designing of it, but we're going to encourage as much collaboration as possible.
Okay, seeing no further questions, we'll move on to...
I do have a question.
Go ahead, Paul.
I just wanted to get the numbers straight. We usually have 70,000 students and 7,000 employees. It looks like we're down to 56,000 actually coming into the classrooms along with staff. So do we know what that number is right now, what number we expect to be socializing, if I can say that word, when school starts, total number?
Superintendent Markowski.
Sorry, I think what we're looking for is the total projected enrollment currently, and then subtracting the registrations we have as of Monday in the virtual school. And Trustee Crawford, if you could just wait a moment, I suspect we need to look up the projected enrollment. We don't have it off the top of our head.
Why don't we do this? Trustee Crawford will park that question until we have an answer. I see Trustee Edwards' hand up, and I know Trustee Lundquist has a question too. So I'll go to you, Trustee Edwards. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Brainy. Just a question. I know it did talk about in the document about assessing around technology. And previously we gave out technology and we had focused on the older grades. But I am getting questions around technology, especially for basically kindergarten, grade 1 parents and that, where they don't have technology. Will those needs be reviewed, and will they have access to technology if they don't have them in the home?
Thank you, through you, Chair. Yes, in fact, we approved a plan today in terms of how we would be deploying technology to those families who require it. We recognize that the virtual school needs to be the priority, given that it's the virtual school as well as secondary students. We're in very good shape as far as the deployment that we had previously done. So many of our students did have technology provided to us from last year or did not require technology. However, with the more rigorous virtual time on in live learning, we recognize that the requests may increase with families, and so we are preparing for that. As a result, we potentially won't be doing the replenishing of the 3-year refresh for those students who currently have the technology. Instead, they may keep their Chromebooks longer, and that so that we could prioritize the stock that we have for those who don't have any technology.
Thank you. And just one other question. It's around, again, a little bit the pre-assessment of students, considering it seems that there's a lot of students with special needs that are in the virtual school. There is still some concern around teachers having access to IEPs and being able to do having the sort of the accommodations, modifications that may be required for learning in a virtual environment, which was not necessarily focused on strongly in the spring. So what kind of sort of assessments are we doing to ensure that the new virtual teacher has that information or gets access to that information?
Thank you, and through you, Chair, thank you, Trustee Edwards, for the question. Our Inclusive Student Services supports for the children that will be accessing through DDSB at home will mirror our in-person schools. So our Inclusive Student Services integrated teams will be assigned to support the schools. The schools have been staffed with special education resource teacher support on a combination of staff accommodations and those that will be able to move in and out of our brick buildings, such as you referenced, OSR access and assessments. Currently, the initial staffing is 8 elementary certs and 2.76 secondary certs who will be working exclusively within the DDSB at home and then integrating over. We're also working with our community partners, such as Grandview, to make sure that there's a continuity of care for school-based rehab services so that we'll be able to keep the programming in alignment. And part of our conversation absolutely focuses on assessment. It is a full school year. And with the number of students, 14,000 over, and the heavy influence of our early year students and that early assessment and understanding of the identity, strengths and needs of our students, Inclusive Student Services is very much a partner with innovation and leadership in getting DDSB at home up and running for all students.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Brainy had to step out, so I have agreed to to chair this meeting until he returns, so I understand that Trustee Forbes is next.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. I just had a couple of questions from parents of students in earlier grades, so particularly kindergarten, grade 1, with some concern about the length of time in front of screens as you know, is required by the ministry. And I was just wondering, and this is something you likely won't have off the top of your head, and I appreciate that, so it can be provided later, but has that had any impact on our enrollment in the DDSB? So people opting to homeschool versus be in the virtual school?
Through you, Chair Lindquist. It's interesting because anecdotally we have heard of some of that, but in fact currently we are seeing an increase in our from our projected enrollment.
Acting Associate Director Markowski, did you want to add something?
Thank you, and through you, Chair Lundquist, I did want to just add, if I may, to Trustee Crawford's question previously.
Yes,
if I could comment on that. First of all, and I apologize, Trustee Crawford, I was trying to get clarification in terms of what specifically, in terms of data that you were looking for. And if the information I share with you is not accurate, please correct me and I'd be happy to provide further information. So we presently have approximately 72,000, I'm using that approximately, students that are projected to be in our system for the 2020-2021 school year. With the current, these are the most recent numbers that we received. We have approximately 14,400 students that have opted out and will be participating in remote learning. So if you look at the difference of those numbers, you're looking at about just over 57,000 students that will continue to participate in in-person learning. Now again, we're monitoring those numbers. As Director Marsh mentioned earlier, we realize that families are still contacting us and there's still some fluctuation in those numbers, but that's where that would stand in terms of the current information we have now.
Okay, thank you. That's exactly what I was looking for. But what I wanted, the question that comes from that is that at this particular time, the government and the region must have a risk or threat ratio. In other words, we need to know how many people are going to be infected with COVID with the stats that we have now, and what happens to that when we add hundreds of thousands of students that wouldn't have been in that statistical analysis before. Is that coming through?
I didn't catch that, Paul, but perhaps someone else did.
Through you, Chair Lindquist.
Yeah, we'll go to Acting Director Marsh.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Lindquist. Trustee Crawford, I'm not sure if you're asking in terms of the risk factor, which we had previously discussed, where we sought the opinion of Durham Health. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, I am, but we never got an actual number on it. I think we need to know that so that we can measure it against the risk. And my most important point is that the stats that we had before did not include hundreds of thousands of students who were not socializing or in groups back at school. And we need to put that factor in there.
So thank you. Through you, Chair Lindquist. Trustee Crawford, when we asked Dr. Kyle for that, his indication was that he would rank it as low to very low, and it is unfortunate because he's no longer with us this evening, but that was the response he did give us. We did ask him that question verbatim and did bring back his response verbatim to it.
Well, unfortunately, that was the question I was going to ask. But statistically speaking, and that's what obviously the government is making this decision on, that it's low. But what is low? we need to know what low is. We need to know.
I'm going to suggest, Trustee Crawford, I'm going to suggest that we put that in writing to Dr. Kyle. He indicated he would take our questions, so that might be the best way to have that responded to.
Well, I suggest it goes to the government as well, because the numbers could be different, but we know that 6% of the people that are being affected are under 19. That would be virtually all of the students. And those numbers are not, 6% was taken at a time when students weren't in school or socializing. So yes, let's formulate 2 questions out of that.
Okay, so we will put that in the list of questions to ask Dr. Kyle, and if we want to take further steps after that, then I think that's a sensible approach, okay? So Chair Brainy is back, so I'm going to return the chair to the chair.
Thank you, Trustee Lundquist. Did you ask your question, Trustee Forbes? Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions? Go ahead, Trustee Lundquist. No wonder you turned it over.
That's exactly right. So I had a question, and I think I might have misunderstood, which I apologize if I did, that there are 8 certs for 10,000 kids in virtual school. Is that what I understood?
Thank you, through you, Chair. That's our initial staffing based on the congruence that there'll be a relationship between homeschool and DDSB at home as well, but we'll continue to monitor that and make shifts as we need to.
Okay, I'm just going to express a bit of concern about that ratio in light of the number of students have been identified as having special educational needs within that. So I think it's important that we take a good hard look at the support that is being provided to the students in that system as well. So I'm glad I didn't misunderstand that, but that was only half of my question, and I apologize because I don't mean to monopolize people's time. The second point I had was about tech, and this is really just a concern that parents have raised. There is a lack of understanding about how to get tech fixed right now before school starts, and that is a consistent problem in terms of missing cords or broken things, and I think we need to address that, both for virtual learning that's about to happen, but also for students in the other, in regular, I don't even know what you call it anymore, regular schools, in the regular school program. And then and I assume someone's going to tell me that they're going to address that, and I don't need to to continue with that. And then the third thing that I wanted to do is say thank you for the efforts to allow parents to continue to make choice. So I know that we had given an August 12th deadline. We are still 2 weeks out. There are still key pieces of information that parents don't have. I don't blame anyone in this room for that lack of information. I recognize there are provincial challenges, and I also recognize that some of what parents need is not going to come from us. It's going to come from public health. And I'm not confident that we got clarity around some of those questions tonight, but I'm hopeful that in the coming days we might get more clarity. That being said, I think that one of the concerns, I don't think I know, that one of the concerns that have been expressed to me is that parents want, I'm going to back that up for a second and say, I recognize the challenge of staffing, of moving staff and deployment and whatnot. I recognize that, and I speak that language to every parent who calls me, I promise. But I also recognize that we are in a pandemic and things are fluid and they have to be fluid. And I am very hopeful that we, I think parents are, I'm sorry, because I'm not forming a thought somehow despite my best efforts. So the fundamental concern I think of parents is that they're going to be stuck in a system and be uncomfortable with what they have chosen in light of the information that was available to them at the time. So what I'm badly trying to say is that I think it's really important as this progresses over the fall that we give parents as much possible choice as frequently as we can to identify a need to change. And I recognize that this is a tough thing, and I'm not suggesting we're going to be able to do it every day or every week, but I do think it's something that but that parents need to know is going to be available to them, that we're going to put in every effort we can to respect their wishes, which are important when you're talking about health and safety of your children. So I'm just asking that we don't decide that we're just going to revisit that in January, that we consistently look at what is happening in terms of outbreak management, in terms of what's happening in schools, but also in terms of people's level of comfort. As these things progress, we may change our minds, and I think that that's a reasonable thing to do for many people when we're being asked to make decisions with so many unknowns. So I don't have a specific ask in that regard because I recognize that I am not the logistics person and I'm not operations, but I'm speaking both as a parent and as a trustee who really feels that it's important that as many opportunities to change your mind as we can provide is what we should provide. I don't know if that's a question, but that's the concern that I think is important to express.
Through you.
Doesn't sound like a question, but if you want to answer that.
Through you, Chair Brainy, I guess I was going to say is that's almost an introduction to the second staff report this evening, because it will talk about staffing and the operational side to it. But certainly in terms of introducing this report that the Acting Associate Director Markovsky is going to introduce to you, I think that we all feel a significant amount of empathy for the situation that our families are in, as well as our staff. And so as we have these logistical limitations, we are really striving as much as possible. And I think, you know, Superintendent McCauley's comment in terms of the special education support. So one of the things we're hearing from families predominantly is they want to stay connected to their home school. So we're trying to think then, can we have special education support in the virtual school whose job it is to liaise with the home schools still, and keeping the staffing for special education relatively consistent then in terms of those relationships that previously existed. So I think we are trying, as we work our way through, to be as flexible as possible, understanding the need for flexibility during this period.
So that's actually helpful because it is a concern that is consistently echoed from parents, not just parents with children with special needs, but all parents, that being and staying connected to that homeschool is important. Hopefully, this nightmare is going to end at some stage and children are going to return and it's going to be better for them, both mental health wise and socially, to stay connected. So I'm glad to hear that. But I'm also glad because there is rapport between children and the CERTs, and it's really, it's gratifying to hear you say that you're recognizing that that's an ongoing commitment of the board to those children. So I thank you for that. That helps.
Looks like we've had a build up for a few times this evening to this next report, but I'll see Trustee Morton and Barnes. Is there something that you want to hold off until after this report, or is there something now?
All right, just wanted to make a comment. I kind of dropped off the speaker list between the chair switch. That's okay. I just wanted to thank the board very much for its commitment still to anti-Black racism in regards to our students and our teachers. I know during this time it's you know, it could be something that could be put on the back burner because there's so much going on, but I just want to thank each and every person and each and every superintendent and the director, trustees for their continued commitment to our equity and diversity portfolio and to really tackling our anti-Black racism piece as well.
Thank you, Trustee Barnes. Trustee Morton.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Brainy. I have a question regarding our Chromebooks, because with that many students learning from home, I'm expecting that much of our technology will be in the hands of those students learning at home. Does that leave us with a void in our schools? I know that our grade 7 and 8 students will have Chromebooks, but I'm concerned about our primary and junior students. Do we have adequate technology in our schools?
Through you, Mr. Chair, with respect to adequate, at this point in time, we probably don't have adequate given where this is all going. But we have a plan to address the inadequacies that are existing. We did deploy a lot of technology in order to support the homeschool that occurred over the last 6 months. We are going to continue to deploy technology not only to those that are virtual learners, but also to schools. So that's a very high priority in terms of where not only the new money that the ministry has allocated, but it is a chunk of the budget that we will continue to invest in. And you might remember that we did put a significant investment in our budget to technology. So we're continuing to ensure that devices are being purchased and in the hands of students, both in person at school as well as at home.
Thank you for recognizing that this is an investment that we need to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Morton. So let's move on to our next report, the Elementary Staffing and Enrollment 2020-2021, Associate Director Murkowski.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Brainy, the report was provided under a separate cover this evening. I do want to start off just by informing you that we're pleased to report that our plan to ensure elementary class sizes maintain a minimum of 1 meter distancing between students will be in effect when we reopen in September. Last week, working with Facilities Services, our administrators completed school space audits of their schools to determine how best to accommodate the 1 meter distancing between pupils. In some schools, alternate building spaces were repurposed as classrooms, so that way we were accessing larger spaces. Measurements were taken in each classroom to ensure that a minimum of 1 meter between student chairs was achieved. The configuration in individual classrooms varied to reflect the size of the classroom. And after a final analysis that took place this past weekend, which again I want to thank personally our Facility Services Department for leading that, 109 of the 110 elementary schools met the required 1 meter between student spacing. And to address that one remaining school, we added an additional teacher to the school, so we could say at this point, all elementary schools across the system are set up to meet the 1 meter between students requirement. If there is a new concern for spacing due to new registrations, schools have been asked to waitlist their registrations for the time being, and we're going to have further direction to schools in relation to that. Fluctuations in student attendance at our various school sites may have some impact upon the reassignment of staff, and we have talked about this evening, it's been brought up previously by our Acting Director of Education, Director Marsh, talking about how recently we've noticed that there has been still families that have come forward after August 12th requesting to move to the virtual learning platform. With that being said, we are continuing to monitor what school organizations are looking like and what they are going to look like leading up to September, when we actually know which students show up for class when the school year commences. So during the staggered entry of elementary students that will take place during the weeks of September 8th and September 15th, our operations department will monitor actual student enrollment across our schools and will immediately respond to schools that have enrollment pressures by introducing new staff. If our elementary student registration numbers pierce the projected 50,697 enrollment figures that we had in the spring, we will also generate additional funding as our actual student enrollment numbers would exceed what was projected and shared with the. We foresee that a potential challenge may arise with families wishing to switch back and forth between the in-person school site and the virtual school site. We are looking, as was mentioned earlier as well, for opportunities to facilitate that and honor the voice of our families, but this may require us to waitlist students until spaces become available, and being mindful that we're not exceeding class size maximums. We will provide a further update in mid-September as we track our students who do come in person, and we'll provide those registration numbers to you in an updated report. And I'll turn it over to Acting Director Marsh to just continue with the report.
Thank you. So we know currently we have approximately $1 million worth of funding from the Ministry of Education. You may recall that initially they had created a pot for teacher funding that boards had to apply to. This board actually wrote a letter as far as concern in terms of the funding model that was released by the Ministry of Education and support for COVID-19 management. Since that letter was sent, the ministry has changed the application evaluation process. And so we do have the $1 million in terms of a commitment from them for staffing for COVID-19. In addition to that, we made a commitment that we would look for some internal commitment in terms of teacher positions, and we believe we have approximately 25 FTE in a pot to address school sizes. So originally we had anticipated that the numbers would be firm enough that we would achieve the 1 meter of distancing in the classrooms and come back with an ask as far as the reserve fund. When we went through it, we have achieved the 1 meter of distancing between students, but we have to be frank in terms of the way the classrooms are set up right now in achieving the 1 meter of distancing. And so we have staffed the schools based on their enrollment as of August 13th with the traditional class size averages, which the Associate Director commented on. And so we still have large classes in our elementary schools, but we have achieved 1 meter of distancing. However, the teaching and learning environment is not ideal with having achieved that. And so our goal then, based on the staggered entry of the week of September 8th, is then to see which students are actually physically arriving to the school. We'll only have a quarter of the class each day of that staggered entry, so we won't be dealing with the full class size for 2 weeks. With the 2-week staggered entry. And during that period, our goal then is we have approximately 35 teachers based on our own internal pot that we would then begin to address those issues within the schools, recognizing that we need to create environments that these are going to be for potentially the year, and we want people to feel comfortable. And so as an example, just to illustrate where we're at currently, in some classrooms, to achieve the 1 meter of distancing, where there was a large teacher desk, we've replaced it with a smaller teacher desk. That allowed us to have the 1 meter of distancing. Had we felt more confident that there wouldn't be more requests for the virtual school and that these were our permanent class sizes, we may have come to this meeting differently. But given the fact, for example, that between Friday and Monday, we know that we lost 800 FTEs from physical schools to the virtual school, we felt it was premature to start assigning additional staff to the physical schools until we have a better sense. The staggered 2-week start, we believe, gives us that opportunity. So wanted to identify that while we may still be looking for additional funding in terms of staffing, that at this point our first plan is to use our internal pot and then come to trustees with a request once we have a bit more stability within the schools. The other thing in terms of the flexibility is that once we've achieved the ideal physical spacing given the circumstances we're in, we'll be very, it may slow down then acting on any requests we have. So if there's space in that room based on the physical distancing, then we would be able to facilitate the request. If there isn't space in the room, then we would ask the parents to be on a wait list until such a time that we could then restaff and reassign staff, because there would be a sufficient requirement to do so, and that we would be losing staff then from the virtual school and transferring it over, or potentially making the request here based on staffing. As the Associate Director identified, if our enrollment does end up surpassing the projection, there will be another opportunity there in order to provide support. So we recognize it's a frustrating situation for families because they don't know what they're going to be encountering in terms of their own family life and their circumstances. So we will continue to try to do our very best for them. The other thing I think that is important to note, however, is we don't want to be disrupting the learning of all the students within a class by having to shift teachers at different periods. And so I think that's another recognition that we have to make, is that those assessment periods do provide a natural time of transition potentially, and even then we know it can be very challenging for some children to have a change in teacher. So that's currently where we're at. We anticipate that enrollment may still continue to grow for the virtual school. However, and we will continue to facilitate the registration there. For those wishing to return back to the physical school, if it would depend on the class that they're wishing to go to at this stage in order to keep track of, are there sufficient requests that we would actually add additional staff into that school. We'll have a better idea on September 8th.
Any questions or comments from trustees? Go ahead, Trustee Barnes.
Thank you. I have, so with the on-site school, if we have an incident where we have to switch to online learning, so if we're doing a cohort that there has been an incident and now they have to quarantine, how fast do we turn around with switching to virtual?
Thank you.
Or if they even switch to virtual?
Thank you, through you, Chair Berney. So we are distinguishing between DDSB at home, the virtual school, and distance learning. So distance learning will still be a strategy that we use. For example, if a class needs to be quarantined for a period of time, and we would then go to distance learning, where it's their classroom teacher working with that class, but they wouldn't become part of the virtual school. And so we are distinguishing between those two as we move forward.
Will both or physical and or DDSB at home maintain our French immersion programs? Are we going with those?
Thank you. So one of our DDSB at home schools is a French immersion school. And we thought, again, there's an opportunity when you don't have to be concerned about geography or the commute. And so there will be a vibrant, I think, French culture within that school for students in French immersion virtually.
Trustee Barrett.
Thank you, Chair Berney. Through you, I wanted to go back, Nora, if I could. You did talk about that the classrooms were set up with regards to enrollment as of August 13th. And recognizing that those numbers continuously change, as you mentioned, 800 have transitioned already in the last week to the virtual school. I'm wondering at what point, from a process standpoint, are teachers made aware of their class sizes in the sense of the class list? On August the 13th, I would assume if those class lists are being communicated, would they have the individuals who have determined to go virtual, would they be excluded from those class lists? I'm just trying to understand the process based upon some of the questions I am receiving.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. So our philosophy has changed based on the requests from families to continue to register virtually. So originally we had asked administrators not to share class lists or sizes with teachers within the school because we knew that we would be doing a restaffing and therefore they wouldn't be accurate. And so we didn't see the relevance of doing that. When teachers arrive to work next week, which would be a regular time in terms of seeing your class lists, our expectation is that they'll receive a class list and the numbers for it in their return to work, and looking at then from a health and safety perspective the routines they'll put in for the number that they have attending. However, there's going to still be 2 weeks of a staggered entry, and during those 2 weeks, when the students are there physically, if it's a large class, we're going to see how we can address those classes that are very large within the school system. So it's a little bit, and I think because different school boards have different histories in terms of enrollment. I know that when I worked in a district that was having declining enrollment, it wasn't uncommon to restaff the whole system in September, where teachers would move schools, classes would be collapsed, and that wasn't out of the ordinary. So this time what we're trying to do as much as possible is keep the staff that are after the first initial process that we've done, understanding that we think the enrollment's still going to decline in that school, but that we've built in a bit of a buffer, and then we'll see what happens the week of September 8th as far as where families choose to have their children.
So just a supplementary, if I could, Mr. Chair, is like I received a couple of emails from teachers saying that their class lists are already at 30. And I'm just wondering if, to me, it's not sounding as if we have released class lists, because the concern would be from the staff, and I would heartily agree, I'm not sure how you socially isolate a classroom of 30 in any classroom of the Durham board, unless it's held in a gymnasium or a cafetorium or something of that nature. But so is it too early to assume that the size of classes, or as you're saying, and I think this is what you're saying, Nora, is that those class sizes are likely going to continuously change as we move towards that September 8th start date?
Through you, Chair Brainy, I would suggest they're going to move after the September 8th start date, because one of the advantages of the staggered start is we know we won't have all of the students there on those days. The first week we're anticipating a quarter of the class. The second week we're anticipating half of the class. So what that does for us is it provides us 2 weeks' time to have a look then, and then determine where the hot spots are within the district. So currently there are classes with 30, and currently there are classrooms that are set up in such a way that from a teaching and learning perspective, it does not look ideal. During those first 2 weeks, though, our plan is to allocate the pot, solve the challenges, and we recognize then that based on where we get to with our internal pot, that we might be coming back to trustees and requesting more, but we would deal with the prioritized issues during those 2 weeks before the staggered start ends. We've already put on awareness in terms of being able to hire teachers quickly, in terms of meeting the needs of additional staffing. I think the other thing that it's, educators are planners, and they really want to be able to visualize and think about how they're going to do the work in front of them. And so I think it's going to be a challenge for us that part of the being flexible for families means that we're going to have to change the way we do things as the staff to some extent in terms of our planning, and understand that it is going to be more flexible, and therefore things like class sizes are less predictable in advance. But our commitment is that we'll respond during that staggered period. The other item in terms of finances is we all are also aware that the busing, there may be an implication in terms of the model that we have introduced in busing. So we recognize from a trustee perspective and fiduciary responsibilities that busing may have a higher cost this year. And if it comes to an area where we don't have vacant classrooms, then potentially there would be a cost of moving portables or purchasing portables or examining other spaces that would be appropriate. But all of that, I think, we'll have a better sense once we get into that staggered start. So I know it feels, for those people who want a definitive answer right now, I know it's really hard for them to not be able to plan with a definite number in mind. And I know that when they see those class lists, and that's why it's important to happen in terms of being there at the staff meeting, getting your class list, the health and safety work, is that we can set the context so that they understand that we're aware of how that's going to feel, and that we're going to work with them once we understand which students are actually attending.
Thank you. I have Trustee. Thank you. I have Trustee Forbes, Lundquist, and I believe Thatcher. Was your light on there, Christine, too? Okay. No problem. Okay, so let's go to Trustee Forbes, Lundquist, and then yourself. So go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Brainy. I did have a question, and it's related to the secondary schools. So I just wanted to confirm we're also aiming for 1 meter distancing I just want to understand, I know this is all to do with the secondary, but, or elementary, but do we have any information coming forward about what's happening in the secondary schools?
Thank you. Yes, because the secondary schools are in adaptive, it means that all classes are split in two. So we can anticipate then that students are in classrooms of approximately 15, and facility services has likewise worked their way through. But the size of the secondary classroom and fitting 15 students within the adapted model doesn't present the same challenges as elementary did.
Trustee Lindquist.
Thank you. I just want to begin by saying I have a sense of the magnitude of the problem before us. I take little comfort in where we are right now. Not because of any concern about the work that anyone around the board has done, but because I don't think it's enough. And here are my concerns, and I think I have 9 pages of them, and I'm not going to subject you all to 9 pages of my concern, but there are concerns that I think that we have to talk about at some stage. So we're setting it up for the students that are currently enrolled, which means we're not inviting students to come back either. We're not setting it up for the potential for students to come back in. And that's a little bit concerning if the goal is to have students coming every day. I mean, that is what the Sick Kids report says, right? The ultimate goal is to have students return in class full time, and we're not setting it up for that at all. So I'm just gonna flag that as an issue. We are intentionally creating a system because we have no choice that is not going to be able to adapt to those students coming back. That's what we currently have, and I think we have to turn our minds to that at some stage. Not potentially this minute, but at some stage. So the other things I'm concerned about are what this 1 meter looks like. I actually, and you know, if I'm out of line, I'm sure someone will tell me, but it seems to me that I would like to see what a classroom looks like at this stage with this 1 meter. And I don't mean like the biggest classroom we have that would be used in the media by some. I mean an actual real classroom, what this is going to look like, because children are not immobile. They don't just sit at a desk, right? They move, and there's the 1 meter between students, and there should be 2 meters from the teacher to the students. That's what the Sick Kids report says, and there are all kinds of objections about the Sick Kids report as being inadequate as well. So we're talking about really minimum standards, and I think we need to have a better sense of what does that actually look like in the classroom. The other thing that we have not talked about at all is what does pedagogy look like? What does learning look like? And that's concerning. I mean, we're 2 weeks out, and I recognize again that we are governance and we're not operational, and I'm really aware of that, but if we're talking about children who can't touch books, that's alarming to me. And so I think there has to be some understanding for us of how schools are operating, because I don't understand it. And I don't think parents understand it either. So the public library has books. People are going to the public library to take out books, but we're talking about putting plastic in front of books. So I think that there has to be a clearer understanding for all of us about what does learning look like. So I'm just going to put that there for a moment. Then I'm going to say a couple of other things. If we're so unsure that we can make these things happen, why are we not doing what other school boards are doing in terms of delaying the start? And I recognize that there are parents who do not want that. I recognize that for parents there are no choices here. So we keep talking about parents who choose to keep their kids in school. There are parents who have no choice whatsoever. They absolutely have no choice. They must put their kids in physical school because they have to do something with their children in order to feed them. So I'm concerned that we talk about that as though it's choice and it's not. So what do we do to ensure that the kids who have to be there whose parents have to work outside of the home are protected the best we can. So here's my concern, and I guess there are 4 questions all related, so I apologize at whoever has to answer them, but they're important questions. What is the largest class size we have right now? What is the largest kindergarten class size we have right now? Are we considering allowing children who, for example, I had this question today and I think it's an important one, who are from the same family but go to different elementary schools because one is an FI and one is too young to yet be an FI? Are we considering allowing them to be in the same school so they don't have multiple exposure across schools? Are we considering what, I don't even know what we're considering, which is a little bit of my concern. Are we considering size of classes, particularly for in those unmasked students right now? Because what we currently have is masking, and I'm not saying that's where we land, but right now we have masking from 4 to 12. So to me, that physical distance piece becomes ever more important for 3 to K, and that's what every medical journal report expert I have read has said, right? If masks aren't worn, distance becomes more important. So in those scenarios, are we considering actually increasing the distance? Is it possible to increase the distance? To me, these are tough questions, and I understand that, but I also understand this. It is incumbent on us to do whatever we can reasonably do to protect the safety of the kids and the teachers and the education staff in the system. And to me, leaving $8 million sitting there isn't going to do that, because that doesn't mean we've done everything we can. And I'm not saying going slow and making good decisions is a bad thing. It's an imperative thing. It is money that is hard to come by. But I will say this, ZBC actually just posted a story that says the federal government is going to provide $2 billion in education to provinces. So apparently we're going to hear that tomorrow. And if that's the case, I am very hopeful that we are going to demand a fair share of those funds that come to Ontario to do exactly the things that I'm talking about, which to decrease the class sizes, to increase physical distance, to do everything we reasonably can do to keep kids safe. So I know that there are a bunch of questions and some ongoing commentary that I have expressed repeatedly, but I actually do want to know the answers to those questions in terms of what is our largest class size? How big are our kindergarten classes on average, and how big is the largest one? And can we consider allowing students from the same family to go to the same school? Is there a way to do that?
Thank you. So I'm going to just orchestrate responses, if that's okay, through the team, because different people will respond to different parts of it. And I'll begin with the request around the question around the delayed start. And I do want to say one of the reasons why we went through the timeline is that I think it was 7 boards found out on Saturday night that they had to change their model last Saturday, right? 4 nights ago. So one of the things that I think our timeline demonstrates is that we pivoted really early and made sure then that we could plan for this return to school. So we believe we have 4 weeks now to address the class size, and originally, while we had anticipated addressing it tonight, we felt still uncertain because we wanted to remain as flexible for as long as possible. So that's why we're not bringing the requests here yet. It's not to say that they're not coming. They will come, but it's just we want to take advantage of the staggered start, take advantage of these 4 weeks to really understand what it's going to look like. But we actually, we understand that our staff are working incredibly hard right now. We brought the administrators back a week early to facilitate the return for students on September 8th in that staggered model. I'm going to ask Superintendent Nevels to speak a little bit. He will be releasing some curriculum documents and talking a little bit more about what some curriculum areas will look like given the situation with COVID-19. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we'll go to the class size questions.
Most definitely. We have a document coming out this week that we'll share with administrators and staff that speaks specifically to subject-specific guidelines in terms of safety and recommendations. From my perspective, and we're going to share this with administrators as well, and speaking as a superintendent of curriculum, it's hard for me to say this, but curriculum is the least important right now. We need to welcome our students back and make sure they know that they're loved and cared for, and that we're here for them and we haven't forgotten about them. So we will be putting in some very clear guidelines in terms of curriculum, and I agree with you, right? Libraries, schools, it's about books. It's about books in the hands of students. And we need to give our teachers recommendations on how you can do that safely. And we have those recommendations from public health, but also the ones that we've created internally from a teacher's perspective, right? Students can read books, right? It's what we do with them after those books to make sure that we're safe in terms of the new COVID guidelines that we have. So there's lots of recommendations that we're putting forward. Part of the PD days allow us as well to spend some time with our staff to answer all of their questions, because they have the same questions that you have as well and the other trustees have, right? So it gives us some time for principals and vice principals to talk with their teachers, to answer their questions, to help them plan for those first 2 weeks of learning to develop, because we're creating a whole new system within the classroom about what routines look like, what structures look like. Thank you.
So I just want to make one comment about something that you just said. So I agree, mental health and well-being of students is paramount right now, 100%. But as a parent of a child who was in grade 9 last year and who has grave concerns about the lack of learning that occurred from May or March, I don't even know what month it is now, March to June, I actually feel like I'm very worried about the place he's starting in this year in terms of knowledge base. So I'm hopeful, as we're talking about curriculum, we're talking about remediating what was lost in that time period, because I don't know how this child, who's a really bright kid, is going to pass math. So curriculum matters too, and I just need to say that as somebody who's very, very worried about the ongoing impact of months of loss of learning. Sorry.
Oh, if I can respond, fully agree. Part of what we'll talk with our staff about is what we call recovery learning. Every student is coming back at a different stage in terms of their learning from last year, right? There are some students that will not have lost any learning and others that will have lost a lot. And we have to, as teachers, be able to work with each student individually to find out where they're at. In terms of secondary, that's one of the benefits of the adaptive model, because it's 15 students in a class, so that teacher can really spend that individual time with those students to fill in those gaps and find out where they are and individualize that learning and differentiate it for those students. Curriculum is where my heart is, so I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm just saying as we return to school, it's that human factor that we're focusing on, and then we start to layer on that curriculum and build those gaps for sure.
I knew you weren't suggesting curriculum wasn't important, but because you're being broadcast, I didn't want there to be any question about curriculum as being really important too.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn it over to the Acting Associate Director, but I feel compelled to just say once again, we have not yet put in the additional staffing, so the numbers are what you would typically expect to see, because we know we have the 2 weeks of staggered entry to address these numbers, as well as the 2 weeks right now that we're working within. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, and Trustee Lundquist, hopefully I provide some further insights in terms of staffing and class size that can help address some of the concerns that you brought forward. I do want to break this down a bit, because when we look at elementary, we have different ministry guidelines that are provided for kindergarten versus grades 1 to 3 versus grades 4 to 8. I think it's fair to say for grades 1 to 3, because we're expected to have 90% of our primary classes to have 20 or fewer students, and then the remaining, so we require 100% of them to have 23 or less. When you look at the 1 meter required between students, I think it's fair to say from grades 1 to 3, there are no concerns in terms of structuring those classrooms. In kindergarten, so our guidelines state that 90% of our classes have to have 29 or fewer students, and then 100% of them have to have 32 or fewer. What we did, we actually looked at the school organizations after the students who were going to the virtual school were removed. We took the time through our operations department. We worked with our family of schools education officers and the facilities department. We have flagged every school that has pressure points right now in kindergarten, so we're monitoring them. And we realized, to Director Marsh's comments earlier, that when school commences and we see how many of these students come back, we are at a point where we're going to react rather quickly and release additional staffing to bring some of these numbers down. But again, as we're kind of working through this transitional state to really determine who the students are that are coming back, we're just monitoring and keeping in contact with these schools to understand what enrollment trends are looking like. In grades 4 to 8, very similar, we are required to have an average class size across the district of 24.5 students. I can tell you that when we looked at the school organizations, there were some schools that had about 30 students in some of their intermediate classrooms. They too have been flagged, and very similar to what we're doing with kindergarten, we're going to be monitoring the enrollment of those schools. When we start with the staggered start, we're going to see which students actually show up and then respond immediately. But I do want to just confirm there are very clear plans in place from a staffing perspective to address these pressure points.
So I appreciate all of that, but here's my concern. If you bring a bunch of little learners, JK, to school for the first time, and then they're in a class for a few days, and then they have to start in another class 2 weeks later, that's a difficult transition for kids, right? We see every year when we have to collapse classes and move kids or create extra classes, the angst that creates amongst children and their families. So to me, anything we can do to minimize that angst in advance is preferable and important. So I hear you clearly that we're going to do our best to address those numbers, and I understand that the staggered approach gives us more time to do that. I just think that parents need more certainty, and so I'm hoping that we can provide more of that sooner rather than later.
If I may, just one supplemental comment through you, Chair Brainy. I think part of it too is because we're being responsive to parent requests. To have 800 families switch over the weekend, if we had said, no, we've already staffed and you can't then move over, I think that would have been a challenge for them as well. So every single thing we look at, there's pros and cons, but we hear you, we're committed to it, the Associate Director is quite correct in terms of we've done the inventory. We know where we're anticipating the hot spots. We're looking at then the physical setup of overflow space, so we're ready, but it's just a matter of seeing that the numbers calm down a little bit as far as changes in family decisions.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Trustee Thatcher, did you have a question? Are you good? Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? I'm trying to look at people on the screen. I think we're good. Trustee Barnes, go ahead.
Sure.
Is it Paul there? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I am.
Go ahead, Paul. Or did you want to?
Oh, I thought you said Trustee Barnes.
Well, let's go to Trustee Barnes and go to you then, Paul. Okay, go ahead.
Sure. I just wanted to ask a question in regards to when we're looking at alternative spaces like you mentioned earlier. Do we have any schools that we have closed that we are looking at, or is that even an option for alleviating some of our pressure points?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I'm going to turn it over actually to the Associate Director Kisco.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. We do have 3 closed sites, but none of those 3 closed sites would be suitable by any stretch. One is Epsom. The other one is, sorry, I'm looking for my notes. Ritson. And the third one is Athabasca. I checked with our facility staff in terms of the state and the condition of those particular sites. Ritson is being leased right now by our Durham Police Department. It is actually, they're using it for a series of training, and a lot of the elements of the school were stripped out because its use really was not, it didn't matter whether or not we had taken out equipment and things like systems that potentially could be reused in another school. So those particular sites really are not adequate. Epsom apparently does not even have potable water, so it is definitely not in any condition to give consideration to. And similarly with Athabasca. So I don't think we have options with respect to closed sites at all. The amount of investment and the time it would take to bring any of those online would be incredible, and really not worth the investment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Trustee Crawford, go ahead.
Yes, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it's important to stay on this theme about the ratio. People want their children to go back to school. People want to go back to work. They need daycare and they need their children to be educated, but they also need to know what the ratio is. What's the opportunity of COVID striking and then surging? And to date, I haven't heard it. One of the facts that I did read is it's like 0.02%, but that still represents an increase in COVID infections. And I think that's what people need to know. They need to know the statistical inference on this thing is, what's it going to cost me when I send my children back to school? And everything that we've done up till now is to reduce that risk. So if all of the money and everything we've done is to reduce the risk, we need to know what the risk is. And someone must have some kind of number on that.
I certainly don't. I don't.
Well, maybe you don't, but somebody has to, and somebody knows what the number is, and I think it's extremely important because that's what we're getting down to. And there's going to be a lot more people by the time, within 2 weeks, that are going to say the best thing for me to do is to not send my children into the educational system at this time.
Yeah, I was going to say, go ahead,
If I
Trustee.
can just make an editorial comment, I can't understand why we're sending in kindergarten children that we're not sure about how masks work or not. I don't know why we're sending them into the system, because they virtually drip in goblets or droplets of the infection. I mean, just to make a comment of things people have said to me on a practical scale. There's a risk here. We need to know what it is, and we need to tell people what it is.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. I think my advice would be we are penning some questions to the Chief Medical Officer, but I would suggest that we include those comments and questions in that letter that we send to try to clarify some questions.
I suggest we include them to the Premier and to the Minister of Education as well.
Okay, thank you, Trustee Crawford. Are there any other questions or comments from trustees? Seeing none, no. Go ahead, Trustee Morton.
Sorry, I'm not sure if this is the time to ask this question, but I well remember the days when we did have a school nurse in the building. So I am really pleased that the province is providing us funding for school nurses. Could somebody explain to us exactly how Durham will benefit and what would the responsibilities of those school nurses be?
Through you, Chair Brainy, we did ask that question in terms of the health unit and their plans for the health unit. And if either of the associate directors have more information than I do, because we met with the Chief Medical Officer of Health, it seemed to me that they will be assisting in the management of education and assisting. They won't be, for example, from my understanding, testing, but that they did confirm, though, that educators would be prioritized in terms of receiving tests. So we didn't have that understanding previously. They indicated that the test turnaround time is about 2.5 days in Durham. It is different than in other regions in the province. For example, they don't have pop-up testing sites, but it's by appointment. And so my feeling is that those nurses are being absorbed into the work that they're doing to do outreach to schools in terms of some of the educational side of health, but that they weren't necessarily involved in the testing side of it, which I know had been talked about in some areas. I think it might be a good question for us to add to the list so that we get their written response. And I'm not sure, General Counsel Cotter, you were with me at the time. I don't know if you can illuminate any more than what I've captured based on the response we got, because we wanted to know how we could really build upon them being in our schools and mobilize. But that's where we are right now, but we'll ask the question again and in writing.
Do we know numbers?
I think they did provide a number in the conversation.
The newspaper said up to 25.
For Durham?
For Durham.
That's a good thing. Thank you.
Trustee Lundquist, you had a question, I think, correct?
I did. I'm sorry because I don't mean to take up so much time, but this actually was something that I've been pondering because I'm concerned about the bus plan, and I've indicated that I'm deeply concerned about it. And I'm wondering if we've reached out to the region of Durham to see if we can't look at other potential options for when we have crowded buses. So I don't know if potentially having some students ride on city buses. I've been watching them carefully because they're far less busy than one would expect. I'm just wondering about giving students some choice in terms of transportation, because so many parents are not okay with the bus plan. So very many, and I would be one of them. And so to me, we should be looking at alternatives for transportation for students. So I don't know if we have done that or if we are considering doing that, but I'm hopeful that we are looking at other options, because students shoulder to shoulder on a bus is worrisome. It's worrisome to a lot of us. So I don't know if we're doing anything else or that's just the plan and that's how it is, but I'm asking the board to consider looking at other options.
So through you, Chair Brainy, Trustee Lundquist, in some transportation consortiums, they do actually partner with public transit, and it depends on what the needs of the community are. So I know that we have the transportation report coming up next, and potentially she could talk a little bit about whatever relationship they have with the Durham region in terms of transportation. Superintendent Mundy, I don't believe we've done any specific outreach as a school board in terms of transportation, but it's not to say DSTS hasn't.
Okay, that being said, can we move on to the transportation report? Okay. Let's move on to the bell times update, our last report for the evening. Do you want to segue into that at all, Director Marsh? Is Kelly online there? There you go, Kelly, go ahead.
Hi. So through you, Chair.
Chair. DSTS would like to bring forward a report to provide an update with respect to student transportation and fall 2020. DSTS has enclosed in the board agenda an update with respect to bell times, and that's to facilitate the 2.5-hour secondary day and 6.5-hour elementary day. As you can see in the report, the majority of secondary bells are the 10 a.m. to 12:30 range, and the elementary remain mostly status quo, with some minor revisions required, and that was really to allow for the 6.5-hour common length day. And I would be open to any questions that you may have about the report that we submitted.
Thank you for the report. Trustees, do you have questions? The chair has stepped out, so I am again taking his chair.
I do, Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee Crawford.
Well, I'm just thinking, and I'm following up what you said about the transportation, and I read something today where it's going to be transportation that determines whether the system is a go or not. And I'd just like to know, for instance, if we made a model that said that there be one student per seat, how would that work?
Thank you, Trustee Crawford.
Yes. So from a DSTS perspective, we wouldn't have the fleet in order to transport all eligible students. So likely you'd be looking at a wait-listed approach or some sort of criteria developed to decide who would qualify for one of those seats on the vehicle. So it would reduce our capacity to approximately 22 to 24 students.
Well, I'm just thinking that people seem to be very upset with the fact that there's no 1 meter there, that there's 2 people per seat, and it seems to be coming down to that crunch. So is it your opinion that we could not do 1 person per seat?
Not with our current fleet and our driver availability. No, that wouldn't be possible without re-examining the eligibility of students and our approach. Right now, if you're eligible for transportation, we route you on one of our vehicles, but at that limited capacity, that would really not be possible, particularly for September 8th, the beginning of school.
And just a supplementary, is 2 per seat, is that the lowest we can go?
That is really the lowest we can go. You may find some buses are lowered capacity than that, and that's just really ride time. But the more urban routes, you will likely see 2 to a seat going to several of the schools. We're low when you look to the other GTA boards that are loading to maximum capacity, which is approximately 70 students on a vehicle.
Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Trustee Crawford. Trustee Forbes? Of course.
So as just before you presented your report, there was a question by Trustee Lundquist about alternatives to using just the fleet of DSTS. So are there alternatives such as using public transportation, providing bus passes to, say, secondary school students or senior elementary students to kind of expand the distancing on your current fleet?
So many of the secondary students already use Durham Region Transit. Some of them purchase student passes that are available. When students are eligible for secondary student transportation, they've been routed on black and yellows in the past. But Durham Region Transit has been utilized by students maybe attending an out-of-area school, or they may live within the walk distance, and they've purchased the pass to get to their local secondary school.
So, but if there are students who are on your fleet who are, say, older, I mean, I wouldn't suggest putting someone in grade 1 on a public bus alone, but someone who is either in senior elementary or in high school who is utilizing this service and could take public transit, is that something that you've explored to increase the social distancing?
No, we have not explored Durham Region Transit as an option. We've been using our school buses, our black and yellow, and routing 2 per speed.
Can I add to that? I just wanted to mention as well, when we're talking about our senior students, we're also looking at cohorts at this time, which means DSTS has routed with the 2 per seat, but noting that we'll have most times half capacity. So for the older students, we have limited that relative to what we've also done within the school system. And I think that allows us the agility to move between adaptive or conventional, depending on how we're directed.
I'm sorry, I have no idea. I'm going to need another explanation because I didn't understand that at all.
So DSTS has routed secondary with 2 to a seat. But that routing is based on a conventional model where we would have all the students attending every day. With the cohort model, those routes are split. So that we wanted to do that, and the request was for DSTS to set it up that way so that if we were asked to flip to conventional, we didn't have to wait while they had to reroute.
Sorry, I guess my question is, though, if we didn't have older students on the buses, we could still have the same number of buses, but afford us greater social distancing for our younger students. That's all I was kind of asking.
Go ahead, Superintendent Mundy.
I was just going to say, I think we have to realize too that there is additional costs. If, part of this is if you're asking us to consider, have we reached out to Durham Region for alternate transportation, there would be some significant additional budgetary pieces related to that. And we already have budget pressures related to the 2 per seat, the reduced capacity that we've put in place, and the additional cleaning requirements related to supporting the health and safety of students and staff.
We'll go to Trustee Barnes.
Thank you. I understand that we're thinking about the cohorting, but are we talking about hiring buses just for the students, or are we talking about putting students on public transit, which would put them more at risk, I think, if they're out of their cohort, if they're taking the bus? I'm just trying to figure out what.
Well, I don't know. I'm just asking, utilizing transit, it could be a special bus. There's often school trippers, or there were in the past, that were specifically set up for particularly high schools. I understand there is a significant cost to that, but there's also funds that earmarked potentially to alleviate that. So I'm just asking if it's been investigated. Do we have any idea what that cost would be in terms of, and if it would even be significant enough to allow for better social distancing on school, on the DSTS fleet.
Okay, Chair Brady, I'm going to return the chair to you.
Thank you. I do believe Trustee Edwards has her hand up. Go ahead, Trustee Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At our previous presentation, we talked about coordination, once you had the bell times, coordination with Durham Region Transit, because there is a concern whether there is even going to be a transit system to support our students. And looking at the time starting at 10 o'clock, I know it's a smaller cohort that is there, but have we had any discussions now as far as routing and times of schedules, as well as the availability of buses for our students, our secondary students?
So DSTS has had preliminary conversations with Durham Region Transit. We will follow up tomorrow once the bell times were made public this evening to inform them of the bell times. We did tell them that likely it would be a reduced day, approximately a 2.5-hour day is what the board was looking at. So they've already been made aware. We did tell them in basic terms, it would likely be later in the morning, so they are aware of the rough estimates of the routing that would be required for secondary students and their bell times.
I just have concerns of where our secondary students are relying on, not on DSTS, but Durham Region Transit, not being able to get home in time in that 75-minute period before they start the afternoon. The second question I think I asked was around the possibility of providing the blank metro or the cards so that they could get them filled for the need for when they're going, because a monthly pass is just ridiculous, because they're only going to be going 2 or 3 days a week, depending on the week. Have we looked into that? And as well as the location of getting those cards to those students, because right now my understanding is the only location they can get the Metro Pass buses, the cards, is actually through the GO stations.
So what we were told is that the Presto Pass has a student fare associated with it, and the Presto Pass can be reloaded at multiple locations, including Shoppers Drug Mart. But I can certainly follow up and confirm that information.
Well, I haven't looked at their website since last I think it's 2 weeks ago. So unless they changed that, their website doesn't reflect that at all. So that's my concern, as far as, because parents are asking how we do this and how to get to school. And just under their quick note that Pickering High School, although it has the name of Pickering, it belongs to Ajax, so it's in the wrong list.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Any other questions? Trustee Morton, go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Brainy. I have a question regarding our busing in the north. Most of our secondary schools will be starting at 10 a.m. One of my schools, though, will be starting at 8:55, and Uxbridge Secondary will be starting at 10:15. So if we look at their dismissal being 12:45, allowing for bus ride home, and then lunchtime, and then their period of study in the afternoon, that may impact their ability to take on after-school jobs. Have we considered that late beginning in the morning, how that would change the lives of our students?
Through you, Chair, I think rather than DSTS, that was around student well-being, and I'm going to turn over to Superintendent Nevels, who I know, Superintendent Mundy, my apologies, because we did have that conversation.
We did. So when we were reflecting on that, we were very careful to look at the length of the bus ride in terms of students getting home and how long that impacts their classes in the afternoon. We felt to begin with, we're going to keep a consistent time. And as we get a sense of, I know working with DSTS, we expect that the routes will be definitely within the hour. Because of looking at that school. And if there's concerns, we will look at how we may have to make an adjustment at a specific school around that schedule, whether something needs to come to the morning, but we're going to wait and see how the response is and how it works for students.
So the bottom line is we're going to start with this 10:15 start, but we may reconsider if the need arises. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Morton. Any other questions from trustees? Seeing none, we then move to adjournment. Could I have someone move that? Trustee Thatcher and Trustee Forbes, all in favor? Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all your input tonight. I think it was, we got a lot done and got some answers to many questions. So thank you. Have a good night.